All right, we're all set, so I'm just going to log off. Thanks again, everyone. I'm looking forward to this.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks,
Let's
Nick.
and leave the meeting, and Colby is the host. All righty.
All right, great. Welcome everyone to our Tri-City Collective virtual Real Talk. So fun oxymoron there, just realized. So we'll be talking about all the ins and outs of our current housing situation across the state. We've got some great guests today who will be talking about, if you're in this situation now, how we can help you go through this process. We'll start talking about how really wild the eviction crisis has been and continues to get worse in Oklahoma. We'll be talking about homelessness and the options there, the good news, the bad news, and ideally we'll be able to add in some of the landlord-tenant law and just how awful it truly is here in Oklahoma, and maybe a few things that we could do to change that. So if everyone would want to go ahead and start with introductions, and then we'll just kind of slide right into what people can do. So Becky, if you want to go ahead and start, and then I'll keep the ball.
Sure. So my name is Becky Gligo. I am the Housing Policy Director for the Mayor's Office for the City of Tulsa. And I'm in charge of developing and implementing the citywide affordable housing strategy. And I'm also currently the interim executive director of a nonprofit called Housing Solutions, which is the lead agency for A Way Home for Tulsa, which is our continuum of care here in Tulsa that serves people experiencing homelessness.
Katie?
Sure. I'm Katie Dilks. I'm the executive director of the Oklahoma Access to Justice Foundation. We're a statewide nonprofit that works to increase people's access to the civil justice system as opposed to the criminal system, recognizing that the civil system, people generally are not guaranteed the right to an attorney. So we want to make sure the system works for everyone. People have full and meaningful access. And right now, obviously, housing is a peak concern with the eviction crisis that has been longstanding in Oklahoma and has been really highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Ashley?
Hi, my name is Ashley. I am a practicing equity and diversity consultant. Most of my services are concentrated in public arts and transformative social justice. And I am also a core member of the Norman Collective for Racial Justice that recently defunded almost $1 million from the Norman Police Department. So really excited to be here with you all today.
And Dan?
I'm Dan Strawn. I'm the exec and the founder of the Homeless Alliance in Oklahoma City. We're a private nonprofit that does housing programs and employment programs for people experiencing homelessness and those that are at risk of experiencing homelessness. We work with about 100 different government, faith-based, and nonprofit agencies working with people experiencing homelessness in Oklahoma City.
I'm glad you're all here with us today. It's really, really great that you're willing to share your wisdom in this field, especially when we're going through so much right now. So again, and many times after this, thanks for being here. Let's go ahead and start about, like, if you're in this situation right now, what do you do? If you're getting evicted, you've gotten a letter from your landlord, or you're afraid that, the money's just not going to be coming in the way you need it to over the next month, what can you do? Is there anything preventative that you can even do? And feel free to talk amongst yourselves and kind of getting there.
I think the first thing you can do, if it feels appropriate and there's not a danger or a toxic power imbalance, is talk to your landlord and see if you can come to some sort of agreement or a payment plan. There's a lot of really great landlords that if you just let them know, hey, you know, I'm waiting for unemployment to kick in, or my check's going to be a little bit late this month, we'll work with you. It's always more expensive for a landlord to lose a tenant if they're doing things the right way than to work with you to keep one. There is a lot of rent assistance flowing right now, which is great. So in Tulsa, you can go to tulsahousing.nanmckay.com, and there's a one-stop portal for all the forms of rental assistance available. And they ask that you show proof of a COVID-related loss of income, a lease or utility bill showing that you live there, and then your landlord will have to submit a W-9. Or, you know, the easiest thing to do is always to call 211, and that's a great open door to a bunch of resources that are available to folks. So those would be the first steps I would recommend. I'm sure the rest of the panel has ideas.
I would certainly echo Becky at start with your landlord, but move to 211 as quickly as you can. There absolutely are just a ton of rental assistance and homeless prevention, rapid rehousing programs. Most of them, let me rephrase that, many of them are federally funded and are kind of balkanized. So, you know, we have programs for people with AIDS, and programs for veterans, and programs for families with children, and programs for chronically homeless individuals. And it can be super challenging to navigate all the eligibility stuff for seasoned social workers that are in the business. And so it's outrageous of us to expect that you know, a tenant that's not in the business would be able to wind their way through all that. And so making that call to 211, they're going to ask you a few questions, and then they can direct you to the agency or the program that is serving people in your situation with your particular eligibilities.
Yeah, I would just add to that. If you've received a summons or a court notice, it is crucial that you show up for your court date. We have a moratorium in place right now on evictions federally. I know we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But the only way that's being enforced right now is if tenants affirmatively show up in court and prove that they've filled out that declaration, that they've given it to their landlord. So again, if it gets to that point where an eviction has actually been filed against you, it's absolutely critical that people show up to court. I would also say if any landlords are watching and want to know how to be like good partner landlords right here, take everything we've said and just like take the other lens on it. So be proactive in talking to your tenants, reaching out, seeing if there are ways that you can help. Again, there's $40 million in CARES Act rental assistance funds available across the state. Sometimes we're seeing landlords helping their tenants apply and find those resources and get that funding coming through. And considering options that are alternatives to filing an eviction. So we have a high quality free mediation service that's available statewide through the Supreme Court called Early Settlement Mediation. That's an excellent alternative for people who may be trying to work something out with their landlord or their tenant and could benefit from a neutral third party.
One thing I want to add, just because I think it's important to note, is traditionally, like normal federally subsidized RIP programs have some restrictions for people who potentially have been justice involved or have an undocumented citizenship status. We have rental assistance for folks regardless of their of being justice involved or their citizenship status. So everyone and anyone can potentially qualify for this, and it's a safe place to do so. You're not being reported on externally. And so I would encourage folks that normally are a little bit concerned, rightfully so, about engaging with these programs. This looks a little bit different because of the depth of the emergency.
I'd like to add something for our Norman folks and landlords and tenants also. Right now, so there's a few things you want to do in conjunction when you're dealing with a notice to vacate or a possible eviction. If you do have a relationship with your landlord or your rental property management company, do reach out to them. Make sure that you're doing it in a way that's easily documented. I really strongly suggest email. You can go to the City of Norman and or leadinggauge.org and find that declaration that details the fact that the CDC has extended our eviction moratorium till the end of this year. And strongly suggest that you guys get those printed out and sign them in front of a notary, have it notarized and have it sent through certified mail, if possible, to your rent property manager or your landlord. Also, 211 is a great resource. In particular, we're seeing a lot of assistance coming through the CARES Act through the City of Norman CDBG. And you can find more information about applying for that assistance, which is federal assistance. So you'll have to provide a document of or proving that you were laid off or that you're unemployed due to COVID-19 and apply for assistance. You can find more information about that at the City of Norman website. And yeah.
So in calling 211, do you need to lead with any information about your, to get any of that specified aid? Do you need to lead with that information, or will someone on that line help you, well, start asking you those questions, like if you are a veteran or if you do have dependents or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely the latter, Colby. The idea behind 211 is you call and tell them what your problem is, a notice to quit or an eviction notice or 5-day to quit, something like that. And then they will lead into that script that says, you know, have you been unable to pay? Is that why the eviction? And if you're unable to pay, was it related to COVID in any freaking way, and be creative on that. And if it's not, then they're going to drop down to those sorts of questions. Are you a veteran? Are you a transition age youth? Do you have kids in the home? That sort of thing. So yeah, those folks answering the phone are trained to get the information they need to figure out what you're eligible for.
And I just dropped in the comments on Facebook the links for Oklahoma Community Cares Partners, which is the Oklahoma City-based rental assistance crew. They're actually processing applications statewide. So if you're outside of the metro areas, feel free to go through them too. Yep. Information about the moratorium and the declaration from Legal Aid Services of Oklahoma, and then the Tulsa County link for the rental assistance as well. So those are all in the comments now.
Thank you, Katie. I was trying to figure out how to do that.
So maybe now we could transition into kind of understanding the eviction crisis that we're actually in, and how bad it was, how bad it's gotten since May, and then kind of where we're going from there. Katie, you had some really interesting statistics about when the moratorium, was it here just in Tulsa that it ended in mid-May, or was that statewide?
That was statewide. So when COVID sort of first showed up this spring and we shifted towards some shutdowns and lockdowns, the vast majority of our courts across the state basically closed up shop for a couple months. And reopened statewide around May 18th. They actually didn't open again in Tulsa until June 1st. But since that time, what we've seen, and all of these numbers are from the amazing work that is being done by the Oklahoma Policy Institute and the Open Justice Oklahoma project that they have, so full credit to them. Since mid-May, the state of Oklahoma has seen a little over 12,000 eviction filings, and about 5,500 evictions have been granted. The shocking state of affairs is that that is pretty far under a normal year for the state of Oklahoma. So it's, I mean, the risks and consequences of eviction are sort of even more dangerous and heightened because of the public health crisis we're in. But we had numbers prior to this where approximately over 40,000, about 43,000 evictions were filed in the state of Oklahoma in 2019. So they're pretty dramatic, stark numbers. And the reason that they are a little bit lower this year, partly is because landlords, I think, are genuinely trying to work with their tenants and being understanding. But there are also a number of federal protections. The fact that the courts were closed for a time, the fact that we do have the moratorium now, have all been working to bring those numbers down a little bit too.
So that kind of paints a picture of what's going on now. Could we get a little bit more information about pre-COVID, just kind of the nature of Oklahoma being, what is it, the 11th highest evictor, and maybe just how that came to be, as short as it can be said, I suppose.
So according to Eviction Lab, which is a research group out of Princeton led by Matthew Desmond, who wrote Evicted, which for folks that are listening, everyone should read Evicted. Tulsa County is the 11th highest evictor in the country, and I believe Oklahoma County is the 20th, and that was in 2017, and our numbers have only continued to rise. So I think Tulsa will likely have the dubious distinction of breaking the top 10 the next time we see those rankings. And the reason that that's happening is, you know, when we kind of dive into the data, we have a lot of out-of-state real estate investors. This is not being driven by our local mom and pop landlords. And I think that's really important to say, because I think landlords lately have felt kind of that they've been the target of a lot of hot shots, when in fact, some of them have, as Katie said, really gone above and beyond. We had one guy that applied for rental assistance whose landlord had been working with him for over a year without getting paid, but the person was the veteran and had some personal things that he had to overcome. And so there are landlords who are going the mile, but 50% of landlords are out of state and they are serial evictors. And so what that means is that they are evicting the same people over and over again. They are relying on fines and fees as literal lines in their budget, income generating lines in their budget. And so because we have so few tenant protections, almost none at all, frankly, because our Landlord Tenant Act hasn't been touched in over 40 years in any meaningful way. And because if I live in New York City or San Francisco or LA and I'm a real estate investor, dirt looks cheap in Oklahoma. We are primed to be some of the highest evictors in the country. All the conditions really align for that.
And what Becky's saying about this really being driven, like the system allows this to happen, but it's being driven by just a few actors who have really recognized the ways that they can exploit the system for profit, was highlighted again by some numbers that Oklahoma Policy Institute shared. If you really want to dive into this, you could watch the 3 hours of the interim study that was presented to the Oklahoma House of Representatives. It's a lot. You don't need to do that. But one of the really striking numbers that was shared there is that I believe it was just looking at I don't remember if it was the 2019 or 2020 numbers. 6% of landlords in the state of Oklahoma were responsible for over half of the eviction filings. 6%. So when we're talking about this as a systemic issue, it's really looking at this as the system is allowing these predatory behaviors to take root and hurt some of our vulnerable communities.
I think the last we checked, and these numbers might have shifted, in Tulsa, it was something like 75% of our chronic evictors are those out-of-state landlords. Which, if I was an in-state landlord and I was working hard to be a good landlord, because that's a really hard job, I would be very resentful of that, because it would be giving me a bad name. And I would be getting tenants who were traumatized because of their experiences with some of these other landlords by the time they got to me.
Last year,
I'd
the
like to-
Homeless Alliance moved 752 individuals and families back into housing. And a couple or 3 years ago, we just made the decision that we won't work with out-of-state development companies. We just work with local landlords. Have to be able to go and sit down in an office face to face with somebody and talk about why they ought to lease to this family despite their eviction history or criminal record. And it just works a lot better. And on the back end, you're not having these constant fights.
I'd like to add to the fact that a lot of the issues that we're seeing right now in regards to racial disparities and accessibility in housing during COVID-19 is it's a further exaggeration of what's already been an issue with housing security among people of color, especially. And for Cleveland County, which is the county that Norman's in, where I'm from, a lot of the original sentiment with the eviction moratoriums and a lot of the conversations that have been going on about the politics of eviction, I've seen several people in official positions and city government related positions share the sentiment that a lot of the folks who are being evicted are people who have a very, these negative track histories with renting, and that these people are kind of perpetuating their own eviction experiences by having challenges, which are mostly income related. And a lot of sentiment saying that this is a recent issue, and these people that are having these issues are people that are have been having these same issues for years. But I found from the eviction lab as well that Cleveland County had a 3.95 eviction rate in 2016, which is 1.61% higher than the national average. So especially in Cleveland County, issues of eviction have been longstanding, and they aren't a result of tenants being negligent or being hateful or resisting, but of a systemic issue. And particularly in Norman, within Cleveland County, a lot of our community is extremely concerned about evictions because when it comes to sheriffs, the sheriff's office, which is responsible for being the messenger of these evictions, a lot of our community don't feel safe with police departments and the sheriff's office because of the extreme racially motivated violence and language that's being spread in our county and in our town. So there's definitely some issues there, and I'm sure that we'll highlight more of that, like the actual safety risk of being a person of color or a marginalized person and being served with an eviction. But I'll leave that for later on in the conversation.
I think if I could say one thing about what Ashley just said, because I think it's so important and we need to really stamp it, is when we have these discussions, and I think you're absolutely right, Ashley, when you're talking about policymakers and people with positional power, there's this tendency to assume that poverty and the direct symptoms of poverty, like eviction and homelessness, are the result of a moral failing of the individual that's undergoing that experience instead of a systemic failure. And we have to change that conversation if we're going to make any sort of headway with breaking down the systems that are perpetuating these crises that we're seeing. Because one thing that I hope, if there's any silver lining to the pandemic, and I don't think I've actually seen this take root yet, we should all walk away knowing that this could happen to any of us and there is no safety net. And
absolutely,
systems that are designed to keep people with power in power and to harm, being poor, they say being poor is expensive. And we see that over and over again.
And Becky, one thing to follow up from the points that you and Ashley are making so well here, is that there's been some really interesting studies on whether eviction is a symptom or a cause of poverty, and what they've found is a little bit of both, but more than people might expect. Eviction is a cause. Eviction causes negative outcomes for families. It causes a downward spiral. It causes job loss. It causes education loss. Like the negative outcomes from eviction are a laundry list of preventable outcomes that cost our communities thousands, millions of dollars a year, that are so preventable, and you end up with people really being trapped in negative situations and exploitive situations, because once an eviction is on your record, Matthew Desmond refers to it as the scarlet E. It ruins your credit. It makes you, like, puts you on a blacklist for good landlords and properties. And it puts you in a situation where you're forced to rent from the people who are willing to rent to you, who tend to be exploitive landlords. And so people can really find themselves in this situation through no fault of their own, sometimes without even being evicted. Sometimes it's not that you actually have an eviction judgment against you. It's just that it's been filed. When they're doing these background checks, they just look at the court records and they'll pull it, and your name is there because something's been filed against you. And that could have been dismissed, that could have been filed illegally, and it doesn't matter. It can still ruin your ability to find a decent place to live.
Maybe we could talk about really quick just what an exploitative landlord looks like. What signs can you see that indicate that maybe this isn't a place that, or what policies may be in place by certain landlords that indicate that this might not be a place that might be sustainable for someone who may be poor or even just above poor?
I would say read your lease for secret fines and fees. I would ask questions where you can about policies for rent being paid late. The internet is a wonderful thing, and you can often see reviews of landlords and properties. I would say look at Open Justice Oklahoma and some of the reports they have out there. They're publicizing the chronic offenders, and so it's not a secret. And so, but I would say it's like dating. Those red flags are only going to get worse. So pay attention to them, and really read the lease. And if the lease feels intimidating, because you can have a landlord who has like a 2-page lease in plain language, and then you have these landlords that give you a copy of War and Peace for your lease. And I've been guilty of signing a document like that and not truly reading it. And places like Legal Aid and Still She Rises and the TU Legal Clinic can help you navigate that language as well. So it's a lot easier to walk away than to try to get out of a lease once you've signed it. So I would say make sure you really focus on fines and fees and dates. I heard from somebody the other day, somebody wanted to charge $1,000 pet deposit. That's insane. And the rent was $1,000. So, if it feels too big, then it's probably only going to get worse.
So maybe we can slide into this whole scandal with the eviction law firm, since we're speaking on the subject of people being exploited, and then there are these out-of-state landlords who just don't want to help because I guess there's more money in not helping people, I suppose. So yeah, what can you tell us all about that?
Yeah, so for a little bit more context on sort of how this can be a profit center for folks, the Eviction Lab, and we're just going to keep citing them because they're the ones doing the best work nationwide on this issue, came out with a really interesting study this summer on what they call serial filings, which are repeat harassing filings intended not to remove somebody from their property, but to extract additional fines and fees from them. And we know it's a problem in Oklahoma because when we look at the 2019 data, again, we had over 40,000 filings across the state in that year, and to the best that we can figure, nearly half of those did not result in a removal from property. And that doesn't mean that every single one of those is a serial filing, but we also have heard anecdotally and looking at some of the sort of top offenders for, especially in Tulsa, we've tracked that there are people who have been who were filed on 8 times in 2019 and never removed. And what that means is that person pays their rent every month. They just don't pay it on the 1st. They pay it probably on the 8th or the 10th after they have been hit with late fees and legal fees. And because it is cheap to file an eviction in the state of Oklahoma, filing fees are $58. if you can extract $200 to $300 in fees on top of that, you can turn a profit if you know that you're going to have people that you can keep in that cycle. And what the serial filing study found is that the likelihood and rate of serial filings in a given state tracks directly with how easy it is to file an eviction and move it through the court process in that state. So they looked at Alabama and South Carolina as examples, where South Carolina actually has some of the highest eviction rates in the entire country. And it's because it's actually even easier in South Carolina to file and pursue an eviction than it is in Oklahoma. We have one protection, they have zero. And it's policy, so.
So now maybe we could talk about how the homeless are coping with this situation, especially when it comes to COVID-19 exacerbating a lot of these issues that were already more than out of hand. So Dan, I know that you were telling us earlier that that testing in the community is actually going really well. So maybe we could start with some good news and then maybe slide into some of the other pressing issues.
Sure. So early on in Oklahoma City and to some degree in Norman, worked really closely with the epidemiologists at City County Health Department and OU Medicine, and recognized that the virus tends to, in other cities before ours, the virus came late to the homeless population, but when it did hit, it was really terrible outcomes because there was a lot of co-occurring disorders in the population, plus congregate living environments really tend to spread the virus. So service providers in Oklahoma City came together early and just followed the science, not the politics, and implemented mask mandates and social distancing, and set up a quarantine shelter and an isolation shelter that would allow us to segregate those populations as we needed to. We quintupled street outreach and worked with the city and county to stop rousting homeless camps, and then get outreach personnel out to the camps with food and water and hygiene items and PPE, and most importantly, probably information about the virus and what the symptoms were and how to control it and who to call if you or somebody you knew had symptoms, and even equip the outreach folks with the tablet computers so they could do telemed services with the unsheltered homeless people. Just a whole bunch of aggressive efforts to control the virus in our homeless population. We started mass testing in August. We've done 1,600 tests so far, so August, September, and the first week or so of October. We've only had 14 positives, so a positivity rate of 0.875%. And when the positivity rate in the county is 8.8%, so it's 10 times the positivity rate in the homeless population. And so really good news.
I would echo that for Tulsa. We did some very similar things, and we've had 17 folks who tested positive, and they've all been able to find access at our quarantine hotel, which has been really helpful. And we're doing universal testing as well, so it's working. Whatever we're doing is working, and that's a good thing, because yeah, like you, I think we saw some of those early things that were happening in San Francisco. I think Boston had a really bad outbreak in their shelters, and we were really terrified for vulnerable people and the staff that were serving them. So that's good.
Yeah.
So tell me about the sheltering options that have come together with the juvenile detention center and otherwise across the state.
So in Tulsa, we opened a quarantine hotel in partnership with the City Lights Foundation that can have, there's 68 rooms available. And that's really kind of set aside for people who have either tested positive and are recovering, or are symptomatic and awaiting test results, or would be highly vulnerable and need an isolation space. And it's housing focused, so they don't get exited back onto the street. They get exited into an appropriate housing setting for them. And then the other thing was, and Dan touched on this, part of the early CDC guidance was, man, our congregate shelters are incredibly overcrowded already, and they would be a nightmare if you started to have community spread. And so we took down our shelter counts by about 50% across the board, so that folks did have room to spread out. And so we opened what we're calling the overflow or the emergency shelter in the juvenile detention center, which can house up to 150 people during the day, with CDC guidelines being met, and then 55 at night. And it's also a housing focused shelter. And Dan, we first started putting this together with the Mental Health Association. They said, we want to be like the Homelessness Alliance. So trying to do a lot of pop-up partnerships with 12 and 12, which helps people experiencing an addiction to methamphetamine, with our domestic violence services, with our case managers across the board, many of whom had been working remotely. We've got tablets set up so that folks can get remote case management services. And so what that allows us to do is give folks that had been essentially, who were used to being able to be in the shelter, and then during the day they would go to the library or the bus station or some of our drop-in centers, who no longer had access to those things. Instead of them being forced to be in an unsheltered environment, they now have a safe place to go to where they can get services. There's food, vet care, laundry facilities, shower facilities. And so that's been really helpful, especially as we go into winter.
So what other aspects of, we earlier talked about aspects of invisibility in this crisis. We talked about how, Black and brown folks aren't necessarily taken into consideration with this. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but maybe talk about how we're trying to address these issues, whether it's the court counters or otherwise.
So I can tell you our data for homelessness services shows that our communities of color are more likely to experience homelessness than their white counterparts, and are less likely to get positive housing focused services than their white counterparts. And so in response to that, we're enacting some system-wide service standards that are going to be focused on equity, that are, part of it is that if I'm a person of color experiencing homelessness and I walk into any of our service providers, I don't see people working there that look like me. So there's a real disparity in representation amongst the staff. So, we do have that data that is driving our plan to do better. We have a lot of blind spots in the eviction data in terms of communities of color. And I think Katie might have been saying something that I talked over. So.
No, you're fine. It's the joy of Zoom, right? So it's
Can you hear me?
right. Am I here? I have to unmute myself. No, this is challenging because there's just not great data available. So our court system doesn't track demographic data. Our court eviction data is incomplete in many ways, just because of the sort of technological system for case management and filing. There are some steps to improve that, but it's a slow process. And we know nationwide, and have no reason to think that Oklahoma would somehow be special and different, that eviction absolutely impacts communities of color at higher rates. Ashley was mentioning some of that earlier. The people most likely to be evicted are Black women with children, just at astronomically higher rates than other communities, particularly white men. And interesting because a lot of people think that you know, people wouldn't want to evict families, right? Like we're worried about the kids. But children in a household is actually a risk factor for eviction. Households with kids are, I think, 3 times more likely to experience eviction than households without. So we have a lot of the data nationwide, and we're working with partners here to figure out how we can get more accurate and detailed information about what this really looks like in our communities. And there are some opportunities, like we mentioned, the possibility of having court watchers or court trackers when courts are open to the public again. Of course, during COVID, there have been some transparency concerns because courtroom access is being limited to just the parties and court staff. So while usually court proceedings are open to the public, they haven't been for the past several months. So.
It is fascinating to me that the justice system isn't collecting demographic data. I mean, every funder I have, and I have 20, they all want to know age, race, sex, ethnicity, veteran status. I mean, on and on. And we all have mechanisms in place that make collecting that data easy. And so for the court system to just turn a blind eye to it, that's got to be willful. They don't want those numbers.
It's definitely an issue of liability. I think that's the most I'm going to say about that.
They're always
liability
about,
is a priority, not humanity, not children. I'm a single parent of 4 children, and I've received 4 or 5 notices to vacate. And with my last landlord, I was able to move into a much better, more sustainable and accessible renting arrangement. And I feel very blessed to have been able to achieve that in a year like this. But my previous landlord company, their method of communication was a notice to vacate. And I guess this would be a good moment to really encourage tenants, in conjunction with being proactive about court hearings and showings, and communicating in a way that's easy to document, like through email. Don't be afraid to intelligently advocate for yourself. I had many conversations as a Black single parent, low income tenant with my last rental property management company, and told them, like, you know, I am totally committed to fulfilling the issue of back rent and making an arrangement, but what you're expecting of me is literally impossible. And the limits that you're putting on me really just ensures that I'll go into further debt or have less access to paying back rent and that kind of thing. And I had to use terms like homelessness. You know, there is no next living arrangement for me and my children. I'm facing homelessness. I'm facing accessibility issues. I got on the phone with one of the representatives from the rental property management company, and I told them, I was like, I'm a Black woman. Did you know that Black people are much more vulnerable to inaccessibility of resources? And it could be you can't get transportation to the site where you need to pick up the package for the application. Or it could be that you're literally experiencing issues of discrimination while trying to get the documentation needed to get rent assistance from the government. I've experienced all of those things. And I said, did you know that's an issue of accessibility for Black people? And the person on the phone was like, well, I don't know what color you are. And I was like, I'm telling you, you know, I mean, I'm telling you right here, you know, it's such a deep issue of visibility, but be proactive, be intelligent. If your landlord or your rent property management company is available through email, communicate your concerns in a very brief but thorough way. Demonstrate that you're willing to commit to whatever they expect of you, but that you need it to be in an accessible way. But I mean, I've really had to become an advocate for myself in higher ways than before, certainly with the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, Ashley. Sorry, can I share one other thing, Colby? I would say on top of that, don't be afraid to ask for help and use the resources that are available. So Legal Aid Services of Oklahoma is statewide. They have 18 offices. They practice in 77 counties. and are there to help in eviction matters. And in many cases, you may be in a situation where you can advocate for yourself if you just have a couple questions answered, or you make sure that you understand the components of the law or the process that people have to go through. And so there's a lot of steps between needing a lawyer by your side every step of the way versus just making sure you access the information to empower yourself to move that forward. I'm really excited about a project we're working on in Tulsa here collectively to build a landlord-tenant resource center that will sort of do exactly that. It will connect people with legal representation where it makes sense and it's needed, but it's really targeted at making sure people have the information and knowledge of the processes and procedures and their rights and landlords' rights and obligations to be able to navigate that process themselves.
So I've grown up with a lot of these traumas myself that Ashley had mentioned, and I think they kind of brought me into not only this space, but into an understanding that I needed to be able to communicate with my landlord in a way that we could empathize with one another. And it's interesting because I've chosen to rent from mom and pop landlords, and it's worked out really well for me. So it's really interesting to get this information and to realize that is what it that seems to be the outcome. Is it worth saying, or would you guys put that out there, that it's worth trying to be with a mom and pop landlord as opposed to someone where you go to an office and there is no leeway outside of whatever the policy is?
I think I would be more confident saying shop local, right? And so that could be a mom and pop, that could be a larger development, but I do think we have local landlords that do have larger portfolios that are working really hard as well. And so I wouldn't rule them out. I think, having that personal relationship with a mom and pop landlord is so helpful. But we also have local developers that really care too. I think you're better off just in general keeping those local options than the out-of-state folks that you can't, like Dan said earlier, sit down and actually have a face-to-face conversation with. That would be my recommendation. And get to know them. Like I said, Google them, get to know them. I don't think that mom and pop insulates you completely from having a bad experience, but I do think it can help.
Yeah, I think there's a good example of that in Oklahoma City, and I think they're active in Tulsa too, is Price Edwards. It's a big company with thousands of units, but they're right here. I've been on a half a dozen different boards with Carl Edwards, and so I love that shop local. They're a big company. Nobody'd call them mom and pop, but they're here and they understand what's happening in Oklahoma.
And I think that ties into a lot of the work that I know is happening in Tulsa and Oklahoma City around continuing to support affordable development, because we know that, again, a lot of people think like, oh, it's Oklahoma, rent's super affordable. Like, well, when you look at our numbers for how many of our renters are cost burdened, and remember that our minimum wage is still the federal minimum wage that it's been for 10 years. An extraordinary number of our renters are paying over a third of their income in rent, which is what it is to be considered rent burdened. But I'm, frankly, when we're looking for some good news in this, I'm really inspired by the work that's happening on the ground to support those efforts, which I know Becky and Dan can talk more about too.
Katie makes a really important point. We talk about the affordable housing market in Oklahoma all the time. And it's true, we do have one of the most affordable housing markets in the country. But when they're talking markets like that, when they say affordable, they mean affordable if you're making 80 to 120% of area median income. And for Oklahoma City, that's 40 to 60,000. So we have a great affordable housing market if you're making 40 to 60,000. Oklahoma County has 135,000 people who live at or below the poverty line. That's 12,000. So what's affordable to me at 40 is in no way affordable to you at 12. And that 60, 40, 20, 10% of AMI that we have so many people, we do not have housing for that population. And so if you're a low income person, instead of spending 30% of your total income on housing, which is where you ought to be, you're at 50%, 60% of your total income. And then all it takes is for your brakes to go out on your car and you need a $750 brake job and you're screwed. You're not going to make rent that month.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we did a study that showed that you'd have to make $23 an hour to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Tulsa. So I that's not teachers. That's not, people who are waiting tables. And we have a gap of, well, this was pre-pandemic. We had a gap of 4,000 affordable units in Tulsa alone. So we've got a lot of work to do, which is why, Dan's living the dream down there with Maps 4, but we're working on our Affordable Housing Trust Fund here, which is now at $10 million. It's the first trust fund that Tulsa's ever had. And, really targeting how we're using some of our pass-through dollars, CDBG and home funding, and looking at other tools like project-based vouchers that the Housing Authority has. But we got work to do. And part of that is too, Colby, like we talked about bringing more folks into the space. So the other thing Tulsa's trying to do is create access to capacity building and capital for folks that might want to build affordable housing in their neighborhoods. Because if we rely even on, if every developer that's building in Tulsa right now tomorrow said, I want to build affordable housing, we'd still need more help. So, we've got a long way to go. And the numbers are staggering. 52% of people in Oklahoma need some form of assistance just to meet their basic needs. 52%. We failed. And so we've got to do better.
And this is a question, obviously, of state and local policy in many ways, but also one for federal. So if you feel like calling your senators or writing your representatives, nationally, the underfunding of the housing voucher program has been a crisis levels for years at this point. And the waiting lists for vouchers is well documented and longstanding. And so until that becomes better funded or entitlement funded, the people who really need help to be able to afford housing at lower incomes are just out of luck until we make sure that program is fully funded.
Both the Oklahoma City Housing Authority and the Housing Finance Agency have had to close their waiting lists twice in the last 5 years because the waiting list got longer than 5 years. And a 5-year waiting list, that's not a waiting list. You're not taking new vouchers.
Absolutely. Section 8 with Norman Housing Authority has received 0 funding this year. Just for some transparency. It's a problem.
So I think that we have about maybe 5 minutes left. Are there any takeaways that anyone would want to leave us with that I know we didn't get a chance to go over the Landlord-Tenant Act, so even if there's something that is actually being done to address mechanisms that keep people from being from being protected, from being exploited, or to really take this issue seriously at its talk about that, or just anything that's good that's happening in these spaces that you're working on or hoping to see bear some fruit, please take the floor.
I think one positive thing I'd like to share is that Tulsa, since March 15th, has permanently housed 422 people experiencing homelessness, which is almost double what we did all of 2019. And so this is really hard, and it's very much an uphill battle, but with the resources that are starting to come in, we are making headway. And that's really important. But we have a long climb to go. And if we don't get in front of the eviction crisis, I think, what is it, the estimates, Katie, are 44% increases in homelessness across the country. So like, we're not ready, but we are seeing some bright spots.
Yeah, and the dark cloud is that the CDC eviction moratorium is set to expire at the end of the year, and as of right now, the odds of federal action to extend that are questionable. And so we're potentially facing a real crisis in January to make sure that we're not just looking at mass evictions. But the thing that I have been sort of keeping as my silver lining and hope moving forward from all of this is just the coalition aspect of this, and how many people are thinking about eviction and talking about eviction, and funders who are coming to the table who haven't worked in this area before and now are like ready to make a difference, and policymakers who may have had evicted on their reading list for a few years and are finally getting to it. And I think it's rising in people's consciousness in a really meaningful way right now. And it's being tackled in what I'm hoping is a really sustainable way moving forward, because so many people are working together on it. And that's what's been sort of most inspiring to me, is just the weekly meetings that I get to sit in every week about this, that have a dozen plus partners at the table who are working on one shared goal. And that's incredibly rare for people who are working in sort of the social justice, economic justice space. So the fact that we're getting there on eviction has me slightly hopeful.
It really is a policy issue. And so the things that organizations like Katie's and Ashley's are doing, that's where the sustainable systemic change is going to come from, is that kind of grassroots hardcore advocacy.
Absolutely. A lot of the change that we're really needing to see happen will start with local policy not reflecting the criminalization of people who are poor, people who have accessibility issues, people who are marginalized. That has to stop, because all of this is, when you boil it down, it comes down to a lack of humanity, and not recognizing that issues of crime and poverty and home security, and those are all symptomatic of income, lack of resources for mental health support, drug addiction and rehabilitation support, child welfare. The list goes on. As I do want to hold myself accountable. I don't know, this isn't necessarily a positive note to end on behalf of Norman, but I wanted to read a few things for all those who are listening. And bless Eviction Lab. According to Eviction Lab, an organization that tracks evictions throughout the country, Cleveland County had a 3.95 per eviction rate in 2016. That is 1.61% higher than the national average. Since the beginning of the pandemic in Norman, Cleveland County specifically, there have been 586 evictions filed and 248 evictions granted within Cleveland County. A new study from the UCLA, released recently this year, demonstrates the magnitude and the pattern causes of COVID-19's biggest impact on folks who are Black and Latino. And Blacks and Latinos are twice more likely than white people to experience eviction. In addition to the evictions that have been served in Cleveland County, according to the Norman transcript, in the months of June through August, the sheriff's office took action on a total of 102 evictions, where in 2019 they took action on only 170 evictions. And to add to that, the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office is currently a defendant in a lawsuit that's been filed by the grandmother of Martonio Kessie, And for those who may not be familiar with the story of Marconio Kessie, he was a 34-year-old Black man who was experiencing cardiac arrest at Norman Regional Hospital. And he was arrested for trespassing. He wasn't trespassing, he was experiencing cardiac arrest. He was dragged through the parking lot and died in police custody 2 hours later. And the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office that serves evictions to my neighbors is a defendant in that case. So stay informed. Anytime we're looking at an issue of policy, it's always a lack of humanity. The people that are serving not connecting to the needs of the people that are being served. The shame that's attached to being low income, the shame that's attached to being a single parent. They're all reflections and manifestations of deep disconnections with humanity that only serve those who are higher up. So that's my closing statement. And bless everyone who joined the panel. I would love to learn more about each of you individually. I love the work that you guys are working on. It's frankly extremely encouraging as a Norman resident to hear what's going on in Oklahoma County and Tulsa County. So want to thank each of you, Dan, Becky, and Katie, for what you're contributing to our community.
Thank you, Ashley. Your experiences and words are really powerful and helpful, I think, in this context, and to remember that absolutely, yes, everything you said, this is a question of humanity and the basic right to safe housing. For people who are thinking about how to have meaningful and effective policy conversations, you also are benefited by the helpful fact that providing right to counsel and keeping people housed saves communities and cities and governments money. It is cheaper to keep people housed. So the studies that have been done in the jurisdictions that are experimenting with guaranteeing people a right to an attorney in eviction matters, which has been shown to decrease eviction rates and be more likely to keep people in stable housing, show a return on investment, depending on the study, between $3 and $7 for every dollar spent. So it just makes sense for so many reasons. And sometimes people are swayed by dollars and cents when they're unfortunately not swayed by basic humanity.
Well, and I think Ashley's work in Norman underlies, and I think I'll speak for Tulsa. Tulsa can learn from how powerful it is when communities come together and demand change in the face of really scary institutional resistance. And that's what we're going to need to change our eviction crisis. It's absolutely policy, but to drive policymakers, the community has to demand change as well.
Absolutely.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with you all and to be a part of this conversation, get a lot of this collective wisdom, and just to really have all those truth bombs dropped right at the end there, Ashley. Those are harrowing and necessary for us to all know Norman, to be in Tulsa, to know that, surrounding cities are really doing the work, and in that work in so many ways is remarkable. So good on you. I want to thank everybody for being here and giving us your time, and just thanks so much. This information is so important. It's so important. So thank you.
Thank you, Kobe, for hosting.
Yeah, thank you.
Kobe.
Thanks to Tri-City for doing this.
Thank you. Absolutely. We love you, Tri-City.
Take care, y'all.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.